So I'm arguing that we have early eyewitness events. Most of this we've already discussed, if you've been tracking with me here. But I've got one or two additional things for you to see. One's new, as of my lectures today. And the other ones I'm working into the timeline here, just so you can see how early this is, how the material is early and eyewitness. Okay? Okay. Let me see. Do I have a... I see. Okay, good. Thought I might have lost that. Okay, I don't have a title. The first one didn't come up there, but two things happened in 30 AD, which get us rolling. And they're two of the six. The first one, let's go back all the way to the gray dot on the far left. And I mentioned this morning that according to the Gospel of John, the male disciples were hiding on Saturday, what's often called Black Saturday. How would you like to put yourself in their shoes? How would you like to be a disciple who's given 3 years, left your business, go, whose business? Well, James and John, Andrew and Peter seemed to be in the fishing business. They were working together there on the shore of, there were at least 4 of them in the business, and their dads, they were all there, had a little business on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Matthew, tax collector. They left their businesses, they left their families. Remember them, Jesus going back to Peter's home and healing his mother-in-law, right? Not his mother-in-law, of a fever. And text says she got up and waited on them. And we read about others. And so we have the reports of some of these folks. Now, even if we don't have, whatever you do with the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, we've got Mark and Luke being closer to the data, and everybody, virtually everybody who writes, will allow Paul. I mean, there's almost nobody who will disavow Paul as a source. And again, I haven't said this point blank, but here's why they like Paul. I called him basically a PhD in Old Testament, who was a scholar. He's a Pharisee, so he knows how to do research, and so on and so on. And we want to unpack that a little bit coming up here in a little while. But Paul is a scholar. He knew the Old Testament. He, to be a member of the Pharisees and study under the Gamaliel would be like saying I went to Oxford and studied under so-and-so today. And the critics accept him pretty much straightforwardly. And you go, well, how? All right. They don't believe he's inspired per se because they don't believe in inspiration. But they do believe the following things about Paul. He basically was a scholar, what I call PhD in Old Testament. He was honest. He might be wrong, but he wouldn't be knowingly wrong. He wouldn't try to mislead anybody. He's honest. He's straightforward, straight shooter, totally committed to what he's doing. And so they're going to let you use those 7 books. And once again, if you weren't here, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and then I'm only going to use 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1 and 2. But then also Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Now, we talked about 1 Thessalonians earlier because it's the earliest of Paul's epistles, according to most New Testament scholars. It's very important that Paul doesn't stop and give definitions of Lord and Son of God and even mention Son of Man. Let me stop there. Footnote. One argument that Jesus called himself the Son of Man is, because we have to do deity too, deity, death, resurrection. Jesus' favorite self-designation was the Son of Man. He called himself Son of Man over 50 times. But you ready for this? This is one of the strangest New Testament facts. No other epistle calls Jesus the Son of Man. It's Jesus' favorite self-designation, but the epistles don't use it. Paul never calls him the Son of Man. Now, you do see that in the book of Acts, but when is it seen? When Stephen is getting ready to be stoned and he looks up and sees the Son of Man seated on the right hand of God. There's a deity verse. Jesus isn't talking, but that's like we call it today, I'm getting ready to do if the Lord wills, another essay on near-death experiences, one of my favorite. Next to the resurrection topic I did the most work on. And there are different categories of material of people at death seen. NDEs are by far the most evidential. There are an incredible number of NDEs evidences, over 300 evidential ones. And many of them, up to 4 dozen now, are NDE data which are in the presence of no brain or heart activity. Flat brain, flat heart. And what happens is if you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, it's a species of cardiac arrest, you are truly arrested. Your heart is truly stopped. And in experiments, you are brain dead in about 14 to 15 seconds. For sure, the experiments say, oh, you might live as long as 30 seconds. So if your heart arrests, your brain's not working very long. Now, critics think they're really making a good point to say, yeah, but there are people who have get some blips on their brain. 2 hours later, they start reading things on the EEG or something. Okay, several thoughts. Number one, in the latest ones, latest case, they're only talking to just a few people, like a handful. The people aren't even conscious. So there's no consciousness reports, no data, to my knowledge. And these cases, we're not saying they can't come back. You can come back from this situation. CPR can bring you back. A very famous kind of example is people who fall through the ice, let's say in Minneapolis and you're ice fishing, and they're pulled out after a couple hours, and they can get their brains going. They're like in a state of suspended animation if they're frozen. So I'm not saying nobody says you can't come back. They're just saying while you're in that state, you're dead. If you have 45 minutes without brain or heart activity, measurably, you shouldn't be able to report what happens out in the parking lot where somebody went through a stop sign and hit somebody. They tell the colors of the cars, the police report. Some really strange arguments. So we're living in a time where there's all kinds of data that are back. And we just had lunch today, a number of our speakers with an atheist, very kind, good scholar. And he thinks that the majority of atheists now believe in objective ethics. There's objective ethics. You tell me, what's objective ethics closer to, God or no God? What about an afterlife, closer to God or no God? You go, well, NDEs might only be, you just said yourself, it might just be 2 hours later. Yeah. But if you experience something after death and it's verifiable, pro-theism or anti-theism? Pro-theistic worldview, anti-worldview. The fact that the universe has been dated. I don't care whether you believe in young or old Earth. I'm talking about the guys who make the rules say the universe is about 14.8 billion years old. It's immaterial to me. But if the universe is 14.8 billion years, where did it come from? When, according to C.S. Lewis, if there ever was a time when nothing existed, nothing would exist now. So you're talking about some of the data that exist for theism in general, and you're talking about the beginning of the universe. We call that cosmology. Intelligent design, we call that teleology. Life after death, NDEs, a moral argument, with atheists even saying there's an objective ethics is probably a better word than absolute. Objective ethics. Folks, we are at the time in our history where there's an explosion of good apologetic data and specialists who do the writing. In my day growing up, there were some decent books. They're still on my shelves, but they were written by pastors. They were written by people who generally studied religion at seminaries, but they weren't specialists like in anything. But they've got some good books. I'm just saying that we can be thankful today that there's just a lot of data out there. And I think the resurrection just fits right in. But NDEs say there's an afterlife. But I often argue this way, why it's relevant to this lecture. If there's an afterlife, even if it's 3 hours, half a day, whatever, even if there's an afterlife, then the category of if the category of afterlife is populated, if there is if there is an afterlife, is that an argument for the resurrection of Jesus or against? Because the resurrection of Jesus requires that there be an afterlife. So when people say, because you're hitting the atheists in a very tender area, because you're saying to them, what probably their biggest comeback today is not to make up a naturalistic theory. Oh, maybe the disciples saw hallucinations. Those things just don't go much anymore. But they would say, what is it about the universe that makes me open to your worldview? What is it about the universe that should make me want to listen to your supernatural thesis? And I'll say, how does cosmology sound to you? The universe. If there was a time when nothing existed, nothing would exist now. What about ethics? Objective ethics. What about an afterlife? What about intelligent design? This is the area known as natural theology. What we can learn about theology without. It's what Christians used to call the book of nature, and Scripture's the book of revelation. So special revelation, natural revelation. What I'm saying is there's a lot of things that before we even start, there's a lot of things that say, you know, I'm kind of ready to hear this argument for resurrection because there's so many things in the world that seem like we should be open to this. All right, having said that, let's take the disciples from Black Saturday, hiding for fear of the Jews. Sunday morning, the women. Now, it is true that the women buried. That was one of their jobs in society. I say jobs, you know, genders have things that are normally assigned to, you know, whether it's the dishes or whether it's today that might be men. You know, I don't know. Things change. But the men didn't follow the women to the tomb. I don't know what that makes some of you guys feel like, but I think to myself, you guys must really have been scared. And somebody could say, well, come on. The Romans wouldn't have killed women. I'd say stay tuned. Because when the Jewish-Roman War started in 66 AD, 66 to 70, and 70 was the fall of Jerusalem, guess what? This is sobering and nasty. But men, women, and children were crucified. Rare for women and children, but the women could have had a right to say, I'm not going today or tomorrow. Why don't we go Wednesday? They went to the tomb. That says really something special about the women. And by the way, we haven't talked about it, but it's a special argument. I could put it in this list, but notice I'm talking about resurrection appearances here. But the empty tomb could be number 7. Next time Lord willing, I come, I might have 7 events by 36 AD. But it's not the appearances. It's an empty tomb. But if I argue the way critics argue, there's more than 20 reasons to believe the tomb was empty by their standards. If I can just start quoting verses willy-nilly and say, here's 10 more, I'd be up to 30. But I have 20 with the skeptics alone. 20 arguments. They wouldn't all agree to all of them, but there's 4 or 5 that almost everybody will agree to on the empty tomb. So the women get there. They find the tomb empty. Now, ask yourself this question. If you're one of the gospel writers, now, we have to get rid of this idea that the 4 guys who wrote the Gospels lived next door to each other around the Mediterranean. They could look over each other's shoulders. And is it true that Matthew and Luke used Mark? Well, it's almost unanimous. Evangelicals and non-evangelicals, they did. I mean, these are quotes. So did they use them? Well, then how do you know they didn't look over each other's shoulders? Well, let me just remind you. Mark traditionally was written from Rome. John traditionally was written from Ephesus in Turkey. So you have 2 Gospels a lot of miles apart in Italy and Turkey. And we got 2 others. So we're getting the makings of a pretty good argument. But why do you say the women were the first to observe the empty tomb? Why do you say that? Do you know that I could tell the truth and say, men went to the empty tomb. I couldn't say they discovered it, and I couldn't say they were first, but I could say they went to the empty tomb. because both Luke and John report that Luke says Peter and others of the brethren. John says at least Peter and John. So men went to check out the women's story. I could say men went. If I'm going to put my best foot forward, I'm going to say the men did it. If I were an historian who wrote one of the four Gospels, I'd be inclined to say the men were. Because you know why? In the whole Mediterranean world, Jewish and not, women, it's not true that women couldn't testify in a court of law. They could, but there was an inverse relation between where there were men around and how important the story was as to whether you use women witnesses. Why do 4 out of 4 around the Mediterranean say women went to the tomb first? I'm very proud of early Christian writers that they were telling the truth. Even if it didn't support their view the best, women were the first ones to go to the tomb. And that is probably the two best reasons that are given by critics to accept the empty tomb is, number one, it was discovered by the women. They take that very seriously. And number two, the fact that it happened in Jerusalem. Why is that important? Because if you were preaching in Rome or Turkey or Northern Africa, and you said the disciples, say it was a men, say it was a woman, say it was both, who cares? If you were saying that the women went to the tomb, if you're going to take that view, why? Why are you saying something that's a lousy argument? Because it was true. And Christians value truth. It's part of our presupposition, objective ethics. So they go to the tomb, the men are still hiding, and Jesus appears on Easter Sunday. I'd rather call it Resurrection Sunday. Easter was a pagan religion, or became. And today, look what we have to pay for it, Easter bunnies and eggs, you know. I'm not saying we should ever have anything like that, but I mean, it's not the Christian story. Jesus came out of a tomb, not an egg. How's that? So Jesus appears. The men were afraid. They see Jesus. And argument number one, I don't have it up there, but argument number one, far left side, is that Jesus appeared to the disciples. Well, if atheists believe that, wouldn't they already believe the resurrection? Okay, the minimal fact that corresponds to this, I'm just giving you what I think the events are. Atheists don't say the disciples saw the risen Jesus. Here's the way the atheists say it. The disciples had experiences, real experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. Almost everybody will grant that. The disciples had real experiences, and they honestly thought, they weren't making up tales, it's not phone tag. We still have to answer that objection, but for the creeds. But it's not phone tag. Jesus, the disciples believed he really appeared. Okay. Very close to that time, Jesus appears to James. Now, that's the first one up here. Jesus appeared to James, and they will grant that James, just like the disciples, here's the way they word it, James had an experience that he thought was an appearance of the risen Jesus. They have no problem with that sentence. James had a real experience, and James thought the risen Jesus had appeared to him. When did it happen? I think it was pretty close. Acts says that Jesus appeared for 40 days, right, after his resurrection. And James seems for sure to have been a believer by plus 40 days. How do we know? Well, the first side of this is a guess, but in the book of John, it doesn't say James isn't there, and I don't want to argue from silence, but James doesn't seem to be around. James doesn't have to be around for Jesus to say, Mary, I want you to go home and tell James, because Jesus is the oldest, tell James you need to live with him and he needs to take care of you. But James doesn't seem to be anywhere around. I can't argue from silence to say he wasn't. But there's no tradition that says that no early tradition that claims that James was at the cross. Jesus gives Mary to John, and it says he took her home to his house until that day. Now, let's say James was or wasn't there, whatever. When James heard that John had taken Mary home, why didn't he say, she's my mom, and he takes over? As far as we know, there's no tradition for that. But in Acts chapter 1, verse 11, Jesus ascends to heaven, and the end of the 40 days. Acts 1:3, by the way, is the only verse. It's the same verse that says Jesus showed himself by many proofs. Same verse said two other things that are very important. His major teaching, as we said earlier, his major teaching was the kingdom of God and how to get there. What was he preaching after the crucifixion? The kingdom of God and how to get there. Acts 1:3, he continued to preach about things relevant to the kingdom of God. And thirdly, he appeared and lectured for 40 days. So he learned that it was a great number of proofs, 40 days, and his main thesis was the kingdom of God and how to get there. Well, then he goes out in the countryside, and again, we read that in Mark 13, Jesus said he did not know when he was returning. The Father's put that in his power. I do not know. No one knows, not the angels, nor the Son, but the Father only, Mark 13:32. But in Acts 1, the disciples say, well, when you return, when you ascend, will you come back? Is this when you set up your kingdom? And Jesus said there before his ascension, he said, I've already told you, I don't name that date. It's in my Father's control. And he ascends. Now, right after the ascension of verse 11, the disciples are in the upper room, quote unquote. And in the upper room, it says there are about 120 people present. And it gives you a verse there that tells you some of the main people who were there. And at the end of the verse, it says, Mary and the boys were there. James could have been coming along, but not a believer yet, but I don't think that's the most likely. I think James was in the fold by the ascension or shortly afterwards. So if I had to guess, when did James become a Christian? I'd say somewhere between the cross. Now, probably not before Sunday. Why should he change his mind? No reason to change before Sunday. So I'd say somewhere between Resurrection Sunday and at the very most, right after the ascension. And James is there with Mary. So I think that's the second event. Jesus appears to James. I told you about that little book. They're just little scraps of the book. It's not canonical. It's not New Testament. But it's called The Gospel of the Hebrews. And it gives a little appearance of Jesus to James. And it reads sort of like the two men on the way to Emmaus. It's sort of like Jesus breaks bread with them. It's sort of like that. There's an implication there that James may already have been saved by then. But nonetheless, I would say that I think the best shot is between the cross and what we call the upper room. So James comes to the Lord. And he has something in common with the disciples. Namely, that his life was totally transformed. I'm going to get to that. But their lives were totally transformed. And for James in particular, to the point of martyrdom. Excuse me a second. Too much lecturing today. And not enough good coffee. All right. So 2 of the 6 are Jesus appeared to the disciples. You say, well, the atheists don't give you that. No, but they do give you the disciples had real experiences. They believed they were appearances of the risen Jesus. And, let me add, the naturalistic theories really don't work. So what do you got on your side? Well, that's not what the world is like. Yeah, but again, guess what we're getting out of the world? Cosmology, beginning of the universe. Number 2, intelligent design, we call it teleology. Morality, most atheists today believing in objective ethics. Life after death of some sort, near-death experiences. By the way, I told you there's other kinds of things besides NDEs are the most highly evidential of the death phenomena. There are over 300 evidential cases of people having NDEs, and as I said, over 4 dozen of them, they're flat brain, flat heart, during flat brain, flat heart. A second kind, you may have some in your own family. You might have any of these 3 in your own family. We do. The second one are deathbed visions. You do? Okay. Anybody else? Do you have any cases like this in your family? Maybe I should explain them. There's 2, 3. Friends or family? 4. Okay. I have not looked this up, but I understand in D.L. Moody's biography, he's laying on his bed, and there's a situation just like this with my sister-in-law. She was at a guy's side while this happened, an elder in their church in Tennessee. And the person will be on the bed, and all of a sudden they say something like, a typical one would be, "Oh, did you guys see this? The roof just receded. I'm looking into heaven. No drugs. No." I mean, some of these are very old. D.L. Moody, over 100 years old. "The heavens are opened. Look at the angels. I've never heard music like this." And they go on talking. And then at the end of his testimony, I haven't read it myself, but I'm told in his biography, he had lost 2 of his grandsons had died. And whatever their names were, let's say Bob and Pete. He says, "Oh, and there's Robert and Peter. Oh, I can't wait. If this is death, it's easy." And he falls back on his pillow and dies at the end of D.L. Moody's life. Those are called deathbed visions. They're pretty common. We have 3 or 4 in our family. And then the last kind, whatever you do with these, they're called post-death visitations or post-death phenomena. And these are usually very, very brief. These are maybe the most common kind. In fact, after I give this definition, we had like 5 before. Tell me if any of you you can just put your hand up for these too. It usually happens between husband and wife. And there are medical studies written up in medical journals that this happens anywhere from, the data aren't that great yet, but it's anywhere from 25 to 70% of the population. And the dying person appears in the room briefly, especially if they didn't see each other. You leave for work in the morning, you're killed in a car accident. And the person appears, and we have a case among my PhD students. His mom happened the day they buried her, so she's in the ground. She's not talking about whether she's dead or alive. And she appeared in the house that night. Just 5 seconds. And the people say, no, don't go, don't. Gone. And they're very common. How many of you have had those in your family? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Some of them are very evidential. So I'm just saying there's a lot of things in the universe that make this look pretty good. Okay. Now, this one I haven't done today. The Greek word here, if you can read it, is homologia. Homologia. Put the 2 words together. Homo means one. Logia means word or words. Remember, in the beginning of the word was with God, the word was God. Immediately, atheist scholars admit, immediately the disciples started preaching that Jesus appeared. They get to preaching the gospel. And Gerrit Ludemann, German New Testament scholar, atheist, just died 2-3 years ago. I think this May makes 3 years. He said this preaching began immediately. This is the gospel data was the heart of this message. You see it in Acts 1-5. They preached it immediately. It is this teaching that becomes number 4. This is what makes up the creeds. I didn't tell you folks that if you're here for the creeds lecture. Purposely, I couldn't get into it time-wise. You have the creeds. And disciples and James, the homologia is preached immediately. It develops into the creeds because a lot of people couldn't read and write. Okay? Now, we've talked about some of these, but I got to tell you about AD 36. Paul's conversion. Critics take this very seriously. They call him an eyewitness of a resurrection appearance. Now, they won't tell you exactly what they think Paul saw, but they think Paul had a real experience. But here's how you know it's not telephone tag. I told you we get to this today. Paul goes and sees Peter and James in Jerusalem. Remember, I did it in them here? And I said before 1 Thessalonians, he goes back again, and the big four are there. Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, John, and Paul, the big four, most influential Christians. And Paul says in Galatians 1:18, there's a little Greek word. Well, it's not so little. Hysteresis, H-I-S-T-O-R. You have to transliterate into English. Greek does not use English letters. H-I-S-T-O-R-E-S, well, the root word is H-I-S-T-O-R. It's a Greek word from which we get our word history. Now, I'm not saying the word means history, but it means something like that, gathering data. And Paul said, I stayed with them for 15 days, told you that this morning. Stayed with them for 15 days, and he asked them about the gospel, which is chapter 2, verse 2, when he goes back, and they added nothing to me. Remember, they added nothing to me, and they laid right hand of fellowship on James and Paul. How do we know this isn't telephone tag that gets bigger and bigger? See, the atheists think they've got you to say, no apostles wrote the Gospels. And they'll often let Mark and Luke go, but they're not apostles. Where's the eyewitnesses? Bart Ehrman recounts the blue circle on the far right, and Bart Ehrman says, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than here? He's kind of neat. He says at this point, he goes, Paul spent 15 days with Peter and James. And Bart Ehrman says, I'd like to have spent 15 days with Peter and James, because he's interviewing the eyewitnesses. And when he went back, John is there. They added nothing to me. So Paul and Barnabas' gospel was the same as Peter and James's gospel in Jerusalem, outside. These are all by 36 AD. And Paul's conversion, the purple one, Paul's conversion, I told you today, is +2 or +3 after the cross. If it's +2, we're at 55 here. It's 36 maximum. These are 6 key events. If you throw the empty tomb in here at all, the problem is these are not resurrection appearances. It doesn't make my case. But if it's resurrection appearances, they're not resurrection appearances, but if you put the empty tomb in there, it's 7 by 36 AD. Folks, this is so early, so eyewitness, so special, so much backup, multiple sources, the creeds, Acts 1 through 5, 10, 13, Paul's own testimony in his epistles. They don't mess with this stuff. Now, if you back up what I said earlier in this lecture, that the material in the universe today says this is a theistic universe, if you throw the resurrection in there, it looks like the kind of theism we have is Christian theism. Now, I would take questions, but I looked up and it was at the end of my time, so I'll stay down here until people start crowding us out. I see some people moving this way. But I think we have 2 more sessions with the different speakers. I'm not in this one. They didn't want anything else on resurrection. I thought we had enough. Just kidding. Just kidding. Okay, I'll meet with you down here, but to me, to say we have 6 events within 6 years is pretty remarkable any time in ancient history. But back in these days, this material is top-notch. And while today, I'll limit this thought, if you don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus today, I think it's your worldview that says it doesn't happen. It's like saying if you're a doubter, you're an emotional doubter. But if you don't believe in the resurrection, it's on you. It's on me. All the data are for a Christian worldview, a theistic worldview, and then a Christian overriding on that view to make a Christian theism. I'll meet you down here in front if you want to talk, so I can let other people come in. I don't want to hold them up. Thank you, folks.